Hey everyone, and welcome to the Greg Liar podcast and also my YouTube channel. Today I'm here with Connor Bland, and so this is a really interesting thing that has happened here. Basically, I made a video about a year ago saying, really, the name of the video was why you shouldn't go on short-term mission trips unless you watch this video first, and it was very, very critical of short-term mission trips. Anyways, Connor came across it. He left a very thoughtful comment. We continued discussing through email. And Connor has seemingly a different opinion than mine, and I think we'll get into that. So what today is it's kind of like a debate / a conversation. Basically, I am highly skeptical of short-term mission trips. I think Connor at his church is involved with short-term mission trips. So Connor, I don't even know you that well. I just know that you write thoughtful emails. So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, my name is Connor Bland. I work at a mission sending agency called One Challenge, formerly known as One Challenge International, and I am their short-term missions director. And so my job is basically helping out, whether it's young people, churches, small groups, whatever that is, to really to be able to help mostly on the logistical side of helping out with really just every aspect of short-term ministry. And kind of the second part of my job is something that's pretty new to OC and pretty new to even me myself, is really trying to reshape the idea of short-term ministry, that we have, the OC as an organization, and myself included in that, we really believe that short-term ministry needs to look a little bit different. That obviously it's been done in great ways, but it can also be done better. And that's one of the parts of my job is kind of getting opportunities like this. And I'll admit this is my first opportunity like this, so I'm very thankful to be here. And thank you, just throwing that in there for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just say real quick that I think one of the things that will probably surface as we begin talking is there's probably like a ton that we agree on.
Sure.
It sounds like already you're kind of admitting like maybe there's room for improvement.
Oh, yeah.
But why don't we start with this? I made some criticisms of short-term mission trips. I said I was skeptical of them, and that you pretty much shouldn't. I said you pretty much, the mindset you should go on when you go on a short-term mission trip is that you're not going to help anyone. Like you're going to go there and I think it's worthwhile to go because there's a chance that you might personally benefit and you might get exposed to things that will be helpful for how you perceive the world and how you are able to help people in the future. But as kind of like a blanket statement, there are like a handful of exceptions to this. I just think you're probably not going to help anyone when you go into another country for 10, 14 days.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I do agree with that in part. And I think that, and I am already jumping back to a little bit of what I said, but just that, I think it all depends on the situation, because if you, and I guess what you define as short-term missions, because, that can be at OC, it's 1 day to a year is short term. Now I know that a year is obviously much different than 2 weeks, but you were saying like 7 to 14 days, and I think that
when I think of short-term mission trips, I think of mostly 2 weeks. But I also would be happy to talk about like a 1 year thing, because I spent 3 years overseas, and I have some thoughts about how effective I was at the beginning versus towards the end and so forth. But I mean, when I'm thinking, but it's good that we like define our terms, right? When I think of short-term missions, I'm generally thinking of like a bunch of high schoolers going with the same T-shirt over to Costa Rica for 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that, let me just explain kind of how, so when I was in high school, which was not all that many years ago, I think 2008 to 2013 was the years that I spent doing short-term ministry in Guatemala. So I did, what was that, 5 kind of 10-day trips to Guatemala with my church group, kind of the high school, all same shirt kind of thing, like you were describing. And I think that for example, like the way that we did it was we returned to the same village in Guatemala every year to build relationship. And so, and I know that, and kind of your point to that being that most churches don't do it that way. And most just go one place 1 year, and then they're like, well, what's going to sound interesting to the congregation next year? Or something along those lines. And so I think that that's where it's a hard question to answer, because if it is something where you only go one time, I would agree that 7 to 14 days is not enough time to do any impactful or fruitful ministry in that time frame. But if you take those same 7 to 14 days and you go to the same place every year and you build those relationships and you immerse yourself into the culture and you really just develop a heart and a relationship with the people that you are with, I think that can then be much more impactful. And so
would it be the same people going every year, or would it be just your church as an organization sending a group every year?
Yeah, it was usually mixed. After the first year that we went, we had a group of 40 people, which was a challenge to say the least. 40 people to go on that trip. And so, but the next year we had, I think, 10 that returned from the year before. But we had only had a group of about 15 or 20. So after the first year, it kind of lost its appeal to the people who just wanted to go on a one-off kind of short-term mission trip. But yeah, so I mean, like myself, I went for 3 years as a student and then 3 years as a leader for the trip. And we had probably 4 or 5 other students who went a total of 5 or 6 years in a row. And still for only the 10 days, which.
So let me ask you this: what kind of was there? What amount of training was done before you went overseas? I'm not saying this is a good or bad model. I'm just trying to learn as much as possible for
the training that we did. It changed a little bit year to year, but the first year we had a family who was long-term missionaries through OC, actually, in Guatemala, who happened to be home on furlough starting that year. And so they gave us language training, team training, as well as some culture training that went along with that for probably, I think it was once a week for, one time a month for 4 months. And then as we got closer, the last 2 months, we did a meeting every other week, the second to last month, and then every week the last month. So there was a lot of individual training that went on even before we left the country. And I think that's a key aspect as well, is that you're not just sending, especially high schoolers that are, that are probably still walking in their own faith journey, but for them to be able to experience something like that as well.
So what do you think were some of the things you were able to do for those people in that short amount of time over those several years?
Sure. So one of the first things that success stories that I will say, was a microloan program that we set up for a small group starting out of widows in the village that we went to. It started out as, I believe, 4 or 5 women who just got small microloans to be able to start up just small businesses, whether that be textile or agricultural, things like that.
Your group started that, or you partnered with people on the ground, or how did that happen?
So we had, I believe, and I'm not 100% sure on the beginning stages of that, but that we basically provided a certain amount of finances through through the team that was going to somebody on the ground who basically held the pot, if you will, and then gave the microloans after an application process, and then it was paid back into that pot, and it was a circular thing. So anytime it was paid back, they could apply for a larger loan or the same loan, and then it would effectively hold itself.
Okay, so here's going to be like my first kind of.
Sure.
I'm going to ask I guess tough questions, or however you want to phrase it.
That's great.
So let me give my my reason for doing that. I think that people are really reticent to criticize charities or criticize mission trips or do any of that stuff because they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And it's nice to care about people's feelings, and I think that that's a good thing. At the same time, when you don't criticize the work that's being done in other parts of the world, the people who suffer the most are the people who live there, who are extremely poor, and they have no ability to speak up for themselves. And even if they do, it's like no one's listening. And so I feel a certain amount of responsibility to be very critical of charities and very critical of mission trips and all these sorts of things, simply because I think it's the kindest thing you can do to the people who are not able the people who aren't able to speak up for it. So with that said, when I hear about the microloan program, I think like to me that shows that's like a step above like a traditional short-term mission trip, right? That's like pretty good in terms of actually accomplishing something that might have long-term impact and empowering the local people. I think that's a good thing. The one thing I wonder, here's the tough question, is the plane tickets and the lodging and all of the money that your team spent. The 40 people who went over there, that's like what, $50,000 in plane tickets right there. And so like I don't know how much your microloan program was. It was probably like $1,000 pot or something like that. So why not take the same amount of money and apply it in a way that would empower a lot more people?
Yeah. I think, and I'll be honest that this is the one point that you have that I am not exactly sure, because I haven't done the full amount of research since the time that we talked first. I've been trying to do a little bit of research on that, but I think that the hardest part, or the biggest factor that comes to putting, so let's say $50,000, if we were to give these same 6 women a $50,000 pot to pull from for a microloan, I mean, at that point, it's not a microloan.
Well, I'm not saying give them the same 50,000. I'm saying maybe 50 different villages. I mean, there are like lots of organizations out there. I think very highly of Hope International.
Yeah.
And I know their CEO decently well, Peter Greer, and they do like amazing stuff. And I work a lot with their people on the ground. But yeah, they have like people who are actually like, you could just give the money to them, and it would be like all $50,000 would be impacting real people's lives for a really long time. Yeah.
No, and I think that the thing that has to come into account with that is the age of the people going. So when it is high schoolers and that it is a short-term trip, and I know that it can come across as a little controversial as far as being, I mean, I'll speak to about my own situation, is that the first year that I went to Guatemala, my older brother and I had always fought growing up. And it wasn't until my brother and I went on that first trip together to Guatemala, and that we were able to both see together the privilege that we have and the opportunities that we have in the U.S. to be able to, for me, it was to start pursuing a career, if you will, in ministry. And I think that there were a lot of kids who had a lot of really coming closer to God moments in that. And so I think that,
so that's where we're in agreement on. Like, I agree that short-term mission trips are valuable in so much as they help the person that's going.
Sure.
And I think, like, I think that's fine. Like, I agree with that. I want people to do it for that reason. But I think the thing that I come down to is like, what's your mindset when you go over there? Are you going over there thinking you're going to save the world because you brought $1,000 for a microloan thing? Or are you going over there saying like, listen, I'm not really going to contribute anything, but this is going to be a great experience and a great way for me to gain perspective. And then I think on top of that, like the final layer on top of that is, if you go thinking that you're going to be someone who's going to save the world, then you almost completely annihilate your chances of learning and getting that perspective. And so that's why I think the intention and the motivation behind going overseas is an important one to nail down.
Yeah, and I think that the big differentiation between it depends on what you define as like impactful or meaningful, right? Because there is that we've both agreed on, that there is the fact of people who learn for the experience, right? But then there's also, I think that it comes down to more the impact that you have on the people from a spiritual standpoint, more so than a physical standpoint. So so let me ask you this: why?
And I sorry to interrupt you. Just
it's okay.
I want to clarify this before we continue on. But why is a group coming from the U.S. more capable of taking care of their spiritual needs than someone who's like already on the ground and like has everyday relationships with those people? Like, what if someone from Australia came over to your church and was like, I'm going to spiritually empower these people? Like, wouldn't that be kind of condescending?
It would be. And I'm not saying necessarily to spiritually empower people as much as it is to show, I would use it more specifically in an area like, I mean, and I will admit that my experience in short term is in Guatemala. And so it's the Mayan population who has an incredible issue with syncretism, like a lot of combination of Catholic and Mayan beliefs. And so, like, as an example, the first year that we went, there was this giant hornet's nest that was hanging over the front of where we would go to eat. And we were like, hey, we can help you take that down. And he said, well, no, it's good luck. And that was the pastor of the church in that community.
Yeah.
And so that's something where it's not like I'm going to spiritually empower you. It's that they understand the basic idea of God and Jesus, and that I would hope so, that they would understand that Jesus died for them and the gospel, right? And so the idea is not so much that we are going to tell them how to or to spiritually empower them more so than somebody who would be on the ground, but it's to because there are so many more short-term missionaries that are commissioned out every single year than there are long-term missionaries. There's just not enough boots on the ground, if you will, as far as things like that. Now, there could be very easily training for, but I'll stop at that point for just a second. But that I think that the idea that, at least that I have when it comes to an OC's view, is to make short-term ministry and even long-term ministry, there needs to be an end goal, right? So if it's our group goes and we empower, if you will, I'll use that word, spiritual leaders in the community to give them the tools that they need, the resources they need, maybe help them move away from something that is maybe a part of their culture. And as far as the Mayan beliefs is what I think specifically in that, and bring them away from that and put them towards really a path towards God, right? And so with short-term ministry, you're able to, like in our case, we could go to different villages each year. There's a lot really close together, and be able to follow up with leaders, to be able to, if you will, commission them out to their community, so that because I do agree that people from their own community, people from their own culture are going to be able to explain better and influence people better spiritually, but it's a matter of them having the groundwork first in order for them to be able to go and truly do that in the right way.
So I think that I think that there's some truth in what you're saying. So what I'll say is like these, because Malawi, where I lived for 3 years, they had some similar things where the Christianity was infused with some paganism and so forth, and we had pastors kind of parachute in and do training for pastors who are on the ground, and then like move on with their lives, and there seemed to be some benefit to that. I think so that's an example of a short-term mission trip that might be helpful, is if there's like a highly trained seminarian who's coming in to help with doctrinal beliefs or whatever. I think like another example of a short-term mission trip that I'm generally in favor of is an orthopedic surgeon, someone who comes in, like there's a kid who has a broken leg in the village. He has no way of healing that on his own or paying for it at the hospital or whatever. So an orthopedic surgeon comes in and helps out that kid and 300 other kids who are in line during however long. I think that when people come in with a very specific skill set and they help people in a very specific way, that can be helpful. And I've seen people kind of like parachute in, do something real quick and leave. And there are drawbacks to that, but at the same time, I wonder if the short-term mission trips that you're referring to, like, are like, especially when a group goes, like, is there a skill set that group is bringing, or is it kind of just like maybe one person is trained and everyone else there is kind of watching what's happening, or like, kind of like, I'm trying to think of an example, but like imagine someone who doesn't know anything about making food, being like a chef, and you have like 20 people go into a kitchen and like just like move some food around, but like really only one person is trained. So that's what so anyways, I'm genuinely asking because I don't know your setup or anything like that.
Could you ask the question more specifically?
Yes. Sorry. The question more specifically is when a group of people goes overseas to Guatemala or wherever it is that they go, do they go? Is everyone there trained? Like if 10 orthopedic surgeons went to Ghana and just spent the entire time doing surgery, to me that's like all 10 are doing something useful. But if one of them's a surgeon and then there's like 9 other people who are going just alongside them, like one trained person, 9 non-skilled people, to me, the 9 non-skilled people would have to go. It would be better for them to go as like a learning trip as opposed to here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Quite now? Okay.
Yeah, it does. And I would say that is the reason why I think a lot of churches, a lot of organizations, obviously they do like an application process, right? And that I think most churches see that as a kind of a just a real quick overview, see if there's any huge red flags, and then move past it. But I think that looking at even for youth trips, acknowledging finding individuals who maybe aren't, that have a skill set that they're able to bring to the table. Now they're not going to be experts at it, but I do believe that you're right as far as if it's a group of like 20 or a group of 10 people and there's only one that's trained. I don't think I would necessarily say that would be something that would be impactful nor useful to the community. I mean, it would be useful from the one person. I mean, and that's kind of the big thing, right? Is that what is useful when it comes down to that? Really, in my opinion, I think that if you help change one person's life, that's doing what God has called us to. And so
I would just be very careful about how you, like, the word change is so neutral.
Right.
And I really worry about using that. Right.
Sure.
It's such a vague way of phrasing things, because it's like you can go and change an orphan's life by giving them an unhealthy, we talked about this in our email chain. One of the things that bothers me about a lot of short-term missions is they go to orphanages and then they hang out with kids and they love on kids, quote unquote.
Right.
And then they've, they're like, well, I really impacted that kid's life, or I really changed that kid's life. And like, really the way that the orphan's life was changed is they developed an unhealthy detachment syndrome, where they get really used to people coming into their orphanage, telling them that they're loved, and then leaving. And so then so like some kid is told that someone loves them on the other side of the world, but like doesn't stick around, doesn't actually love them. I mean, like doesn't actually do things that show love, except for maybe that 2-week period. And then that orphan, the entire rest of its life, has this like really unhealthy detachment syndrome that it will either suffer for the rest of its life or have to go through a lot of therapy or something to get over it. So
oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't remember how that tied into the change word. The change is what I was going. Yeah.
Right. Yes. And you are correct that it is very vague, and I apologize for using that in such a vague context. One thing that I did want to ask you, as far as your, because I can see that happening as far as detachment syndrome for orphans. But so then what is the alternative? Because if you send money to an orphanage to help provide for things, you're either most of the time, I would say, or some of the time, I should say, that either the older kids would be brought in and said like, hey, this money was donated by this church in this in this country far away, and we're using it to do this, right? And so I mean, I guess what would be the alternative to not showing up at all? And then I would also tack on the end, just being, which I know is a bit of a different question, but that just in like James 1:27 in the Bible, talking about how like taking care of orphans and widows and how that should look if we can't do that either that we could do that in long term, but not in short term.
Okay, so this is an awesome place to go. Like I love the question that you just asked. Yeah. So for one thing, I care about like sustainable solutions, right? People that word sustainable gets thrown around like it's a football or something, but I'm like, generally sustainable solutions are good, right? Also, James 1:27, widows and orphans are in their own category. You can just take care of them. You can just like love them. If they're in distress, you can help them. That's like okay. And I'm fine with that. I'm highly skeptical that, like, imagine that there's an orphanage in like 3 blocks from you, and every month you send people to hang out with the orphans there for a week, and the kids show up and they're like, I love you, but then they leave and they never show up again. And you just do that to kids who are like Americans who are just down the street from you.
Sure.
That like that's like a uncomfortable thing to think about. Like if you really think about how that is, but that's like actually what's happening in these other parts of the world. So like, I don't consider that caring for orphans. And you asked what the alternative is. The alternative, and I would point our viewers or listeners to an episode 2 or 3 episodes ago where I talked with Georgina Hill, and it's called "Beware of Bad Orphanages."
Yeah.
And the idea behind it is that there is a place for some orphanages, but a lot of times what we've done in other parts of the world is we've incentivized orphan care as opposed to incentivizing family care. And so to me, the solution to a lot of these really complicated situations is to empower the family and the community. And so as much as possible, it's better for an orphan to be taken care of, not by some orphan director, but by either an aunt or just some kind of caretaker that has some investment in them growing up and is not just like receiving a paycheck and making sure that they get fed.
Sure.
Yeah. So family care would be like the alternative that I think actually cares for orphans.
Yeah. No, and that's great. One thing that I did want to mention on the first thing that you mentioned about that being a good question as far as sustainable things, like that's one of the things that I wanted to at least put out there for you, for the people watching, is that I was hoping that yes, this is a bit of a, kind of back and forth, but that we look to see what can we do to make short-term ministry better, I guess, is kind of the big thing, right? And I mean, that's what my job is here at OC, and that's what we hope to see when it comes to short-term ministry around the world, is like, what does that look like? How can we improve the way that it's been done? And can we encourage churches, groups, individuals in a way that really helps to make a meaningful, sustainable impact in the future? And also, like I had mentioned before, just that there's an end goal. Like, I'm a firm believer that there should always be an end goal in ministry, long-term or short-term, because it develops, otherwise it develops the dependency that you kind of talk about, right? Because I mean, there's even, there's a lot of examples of that, like an orphanage, like long-term, even if you're there for 3 years, isn't it going to be even harder for that kid to see you go after 3 years? So, I mean, and so just kind of saying, I mean, whether it's the long-term or the short-term side of things, like how can we really, just like put our heads together as the big C church, if you will, and really say like, what can we do to move ministry forward instead of just stopping at, the easy stuff.
Yeah, well, I guess in regards to that, I'm glad that you're asking that, and I think that I think it's very good that you're talking about setting goals and trying to meet those goals, because that's not something that often happens. A lot of times, what happens is it's just like, and a lot of times the goals are not worthy goals, like getting a conversion or whatever. It can be a very shallow nothing. Because it could like not be real. Like there's a whole lot of things that go into that. So anyways, I think setting goals is something that is a great place to start. But one of the things I guess I'll post my flag on is I'm highly skeptical that that short-term mission trips are worth being called mission trips unless there's like someone who's highly skilled going for a very specific purpose. Otherwise, to me, it's like it's like what do you call it when you like go on a cruise or something? It's just a vacation. More like that. It's more like it's a way to get perspective or an education. It's basically a way to build yourself up, as opposed to doing anything that's going to help the people over there. And I said, I want people to go overseas. Like that's the only way that people get it through their heads that poverty exists in the world. And I'm really passionate about people understanding that poverty exists. It's just that I want people, when they go over, I want them to actually learn and be in a place where they're going to be receptive to it, not go over there thinking they're going to save the world, which is not, it sounds like what you're doing. I'm overgeneralizing because we're talking about a lot of people.
Yeah. And then I think to that, I think is really the part of, I guess, the biggest disagreement that comes into it is really that you had mentioned kind of about the conversion thing and not being real, potentially, and that there are potentials for that, of course. And I think that anybody who's been on a short-term mission and kind of taken some perspective afterwards can really attest to that. But I think that the difference would be is the fact that we can't, as humans, as individuals, we really cannot say whether somebody is truly taking that commitment or not, right? But the idea of even let's call it a conversional mission, a mission trip, right? A true mission trip, which is like in a Protestant kind of fashion, if you will, as far as like going and going for the sole purpose of conversion. And that's the only thing that you're doing there. You're not doing anything physical. You're not doing what I would call mercy ministry. I watched this really great video last night from a sociologist at Baylor University who spoke on that the highest impact, short or long-term ministry through his research that he's done for, I can't remember the number of years right now, and I don't want to misquote it, but that the highest impact ministry is conversional only ministry, because there is no going and saying we're capable of doing something better than you are, so we're going to do it. And I think that is, there are some exceptions to that, because like you were talking about medical ministry in Africa, right? That is something that they don't have access to that. So that's in a different category to me when it comes to what we're talking about, like high school short-term mission trips.
Yeah.
If we were to say, if we were to train up, upperclassmen being like junior, seniors of high schools, to really be, to pick out the ones, if you will, that are solid in their faith enough to really go and proclaim the gospel, to use it as a conversional ministry, if you will. That the sociologist had said that not just not measurably, because it is hard to measure that, but that between the economic and the mental health, along with some other factors that he mentioned, and I can put a link in it.
Yeah, send me a link after this.
Yeah, and but that, and I'm sorry, I'm probably not getting all the pieces in there, but that that I think that's really a big thing that a lot of short-term trips are not looking at, and a lot of ministry in general isn't looking at, is it's more what can we do physically for these people instead of spiritually, and that yes, there are a lot of pitfalls to that, and there can be a lot of pitfalls to that, as far as if you send somebody who's not fully secure in their faith, somebody who's not able to make really a stand, place the flag in the ground, if you will, as you mentioned, like for what they believe in God, and convert. And I don't like using that word convert, but convert people to Christ. That is, that's the Great Commission, right? Is to go forth and make disciples of many nations, and disciples more so are on a spiritual term, right? It's like create people who are going to really proclaim the gospel to other peoples in their communities and in their region, because that's, I think that's kind of the part where I would say is that it's an impactful ministry, but it's not. You really can't measure it for the same reasons that you said,
Well, okay. So I agree that it's possible to meet someone on the street for 5 minutes, and that meeting could completely change their life, even though you never see them again. It's a possibility for sure. I'll start with that. I also, earlier when I was referring to, I was talking about whether or not you know if a conversion is authentic. I was really like in Malawi, just by the fact that I was white, I had this, I had this like status or whatever in that community, because I'm such a rare thing, and all of the white people that they ever meet are either like missionaries or Peace Corps workers or whatever, just like people who are like trying to help them. And so like just by virtue of me being a white person, people, and also Malawi's culture is very they're very like appeasing. Like they care more about an interaction going well than they do about, often I'm overgeneralizing, but a lot of times they care more about an interaction going well. They care about that more than like the truth or whatever. So like if I were to stop people on the side of the street and say, hey, how do I get to the grocery store? They would, even if they don't know the answer, they just want the interaction to go well. So they would make up some directions and smile at you, and you guys would fist bump or whatever. And so when I was talking about conversions possibly being inauthentic, I was referring to some of those dynamics that are more prevalent when, when you don't understand the culture very well.
Yeah.
And so, but I do agree that it's possible for, for you meet someone and you hang out with them for a couple weeks and you're able to impact their life in a meaningful way. That's that right there. What you're talking about, what it sounds like you desire is so not scrutinized. Like people don't want to go overseas and come back and be told that they did nothing. And they don't want to pony up $3,000 to go on a trip that is going to accomplish nothing. And so there's this huge incentive for everyone to pretend like something meaningful happened when in a lot of cases it doesn't. And then there's a massive incentive not to even scrutinize like what's going on.
Sure.
And so, and so I just thought that was something that's worth bringing up.
Yeah. No, and I agree. And one of the other things that I will throw in at this point that I think is worth noting as well, like OC, the organization I work for, we're part of something that's called the Global Alliance, and it's, I believe, 12 or 13 different countries at this point that are sending out missionaries, both short-term and long-term. And so the question that, so like a big like a big point of that is like a lot of people from Guatemala want to go and minister in Europe. And so Guatemala is one of our sending countries. And so they send missionaries to Spain where they speak the language. And then usually they're sent out into kind of the Middle East region, right? Because they blend in better. They're not white. They're not, and things like that. So, and that's another, I know that's kind of a different story as far as short-term ministry, because as far as the, secure locations, it usually comes down to more the personal conversional type ministry instead of physical acts, if you will. But I think that that's something worth noting as well, is that it's not necessarily just the U.S. Who puts out a bunch of short-term and long-term missionaries worldwide, because it was we have this chart up in our office that shows that I think it was 10 or 12 years ago, 80% of the missionaries in the world were sent through the United States. And then as time has gone on, we have another little graph that kind of shows NOC, right? And currently at our organization, we have more international missionaries than we do US-based missionaries. And so, and I think that is another big, a big part of short-term ministry, that it doesn't have to just be us, better than everybody white people, and I mean that sarcastically. I want to make sure that comes across.
I understand.
But that's kind of the view that some people, I think in the U.S. especially, think that ministry is all us. It's all the U.S. But that there are other countries in the world sending out missionaries to more appropriate places. Like there are Guatemalan missionaries that go to a lot of different places in Central and South America. So it's literally their own, their own culture, their own people, maybe a different culture, depending on where you go. But and so I think that, I think it was worth mentioning that it's not just the broad or the small window of U.S. based short-term missions, but as well as global missions as well.
Okay, and I think that's a helpful distinction. I think we're about to wrap up here. I'll say one more thing, kind of my closing thing, that I think is I like to talk about a lot, and then I'll let you say something, and then we'll stop it after that. So, but this has been a really good discussion. So, first let me just thank you, dude. It's awesome that you were willing to have this discussion. It sounds like what you were saying at the beginning, it's not something that you've done before, and so it takes a lot of guts to come in and do this live and have this posted in different places. And so, props to you for that. Everyone should have a lot of respect for that willingness. And I think that I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the reasons you did this is you thought that this would be a beneficial thing for people to check out, because it's like a long form conversation about a very complicated subject, and it's hard to get these ideas out in a short amount of time. Okay, so I just want to say thank you for that. My last kind of parting words are, earlier you said something, you kind of asked like, what's the alternative? Like what should we do instead of short-term missions or hanging out with orphans or whatever? And I think in almost every case, I would say like the alternative is like, don't worry about other people, just like worry about yourself. If you want to, if you care about refugees, go over to where the refugees are and spend time with them and help them and feed them and raise money for them specifically, and like give your own money to them. Like if you care about refugees, go do that. If you care about orphans, adopt an orphan if you care about the hungry or whatever. Like, I know that everyone wants to worry about systemic change, but if you don't, if you're not doing things personally yourself first, you have like no hope for systemic change. And so I would highly encourage everyone who's wanting to make a change in the world. The way that you start is with yourself and your own actions and what you do for yourself. And so I highly encourage people to frame things that way. Like, what am I doing myself? And then once you start doing things yourself, you realize how hard these things are, and then you're a little bit less critical of the work that other people are doing.
Yeah. No, that's great, man. I think that's really great. And I'll start off my final words just by saying thank you for giving me the opportunity to come on your podcast and to be able to do this. The last thing that I'll say is really just that whether it's short-term ministry, long-term ministry, like obviously short-term is a bit of a hot topic in the church right now as far as whether it's effective or not. And I would really just say that do what God calls you to. I mean, like for me, I had an instance last year where I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis. So I really can't live in rural places of the world where I feel like God is calling me. So at the beginning of last year was when I got accepted here at OC, and I began to raise my support to be able to be a US based missionary, to be able to talk about these kinds of things. And I'm just so thankful that I really believe that God brought us together talking about all this. And I think that it's a huge blessing for hopefully anybody who's watching to know that this isn't an argument. This isn't meant to belittle anybody, but this was meant to really just get an idea of even just a starting point for how can we change ministry in general to look better for the Great Commission and James 1:27, just like parts of the Bible that God really commissions us, the Great Commission, to go forth and make disciples and to do it in a way that is loving and caring for people everywhere. So again, thank you.
Yeah, Connor, thank you so much. And for all of our viewers and our listeners, appreciate you doing that. And yeah, well, I guess, Connor, do you have like Twitter or anything like that you want to?
I don't have a Twitter currently that I use. So I would say that probably Facebook would be one of the best places. And it's Connor Nicholas Bland on Facebook. Feel free to.
We'll get a link to all this stuff, including what you were saying about the person from Baylor. I think that'd be interesting. And we'll link that down below. So thank you everyone for watching. Connor, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no problem.
See you guys later. Bye.